I personally am very excited to hear from all the presenters and the wonderful findings and work that they've done to address this issue, and certainly how we can use this information moving forward in response to what's happened as a result of the pandemic, and particularly for survivors of domestic violence. I would like to just take a moment to do a little bit of housekeeping, which is if you are not speaking, which of course will be the presenters, please make sure that your mic is muted at all times so that everyone can hear our wonderful presenters and not have distractions and such. We also know that you will have many questions. What we suggest is please either put those in the chat and or write them down for yourselves. We will have a period of time at the end of the panel discussion for responding to those questions. So please make sure that you do that and don't go away without making sure that we're able to respond. We are very committed to making this as interactive as possible and as you can with virtual. So we want to make sure that we're able to respond to your questions. What we're going to do is do some quick bios. We're going to allow for about 20 minutes per presentation. And then of course, at the end, allow some time for questions and answers, just so you know how we're going to approach this. Can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you here and listening to these wonderful experts and the information that they have to share with you. What I'm going to do is read bios very quickly. My name is Ruth Glenn. I am currently the Chief Executive Officer of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. It's a 40-year-old institution or organization that has dealt with domestic violence issues from a policy perspective, from a project perspective, and certainly from a program perspective. We're survivor-centric, so everything and anything that we do is from the perspective of survivors. I'm a survivor myself. I've been here 6 years, and I, as personally as well, make sure that we are focused on what is best for survivors by giving a survivor perspective myself and or reaching out to our membership consistently to ask what are survivors telling them about the needs that they have. It's been very challenging over the course of 6 years to make sure that we address those needs, try to help domestic violence programs respond to those needs, but we do the best that we can. With that said, I'm going to read the other bios. With us, we have Dr. Bethany Backus, who's an assistant professor at the Violence Against Women Faculty Cluster at the University of Central Florida.
No, I don't think so.
Would someone please mind muting? Thank you. and Dr. Backus holds a joint appointment in the Department of Justice and School of Social Work. She has almost 20 years of combined experience in domestic violence direct services and research. Prior to joining UCF, she served as the Director of Research and Evaluation for the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at the University of Texas and was a faculty fellow in the Center for Health and Social Policy. Backus also spent a decade in the National Institute of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice, directing research and evaluation, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, stalking, violent and victimization, and researcher practitioner partnerships and wrongful conviction. Bethany, would you mind terribly raising your hand? I know we have our names up, but give a little wave. Thank you. Dr. Justin Nix is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. He received his PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of South Carolina. His research is centered in policing with a focus on legitimacy. His work has recently appeared in Justice Quarterly, Crime and Delinquency, Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and Journal of Criminal Justice. Justin, thank you. Dr. Chera Richards is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She is also a faculty lead at UNO's Victimology and Victim Services Research Lab. She received her PhD in criminology from the University of South Florida. Her research is centered in victimology with recent.
It's Angela. You mean it's not Angela? It is Angela.
Would someone mind terribly muting? Thank you. She received her PhD in criminology from the University of South Florida. Her research is centered in victimology with recent articles appearing in Journal of Interpersonal Violence, Justice, Quarterly, and Law and Human Behavior. Tara? She's also the herder of this group. So thank you so much, Tara, for making sure that we've gotten here today and in the way in which we've gotten here. Dr. Elaine Arnall is Associate Dean and Director in the Institute of Society and Community at the University of Wolverhampton, Chair of the Division of Women in Crime and American Society of Criminology, active member of European Society of Criminology and Working Group on Gender and Visiting Professor, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. She was the chair and presenter of Empowering Girls and Women Experience Violence in the Family at the United Nations 63rd Commission on the Status of Women, March 2019. She's done this before. Elaine has attracted over many, because it's in European, so I don't know how to read that, in research funding as principal investigator and advice. Quorum on the effective practice strategy, worked with policymakers in the Home Office and across criminal justice, juvenile health, and social care. She is a qualified social worker and worked as a probation officer in London. Elaine? Great, thank you. Dr. Moha Kanjiel, did I say it right? I really did try to practice. Thank you so much. Is a lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton and a social researcher specializing in community participatory research with minority ethnic communities in the UK. Her principal research focus is engaging diverse communities, academic research, and including service users' voices. Can we remember to mute, please? She has delivered research for local authorities, clinical commissioning groups, and social service providers for the past 10 years. Mihoa often uses digital platforms in order to share research reports in accessible formats such as videos and documentary films for those hard to reach communities. Can you give us a wave? Thank you. Susie Hawks is a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton and studying towards a PhD in the University of Durham, where she is researching how do social workers make differential risk decisions in regards to domestic abuse when understanding assessments of children and their families. She is primarily interested in researching social work practice in regard to children protection and safeguarding. She is a qualified social worker and practiced as a social worker and manager in children and families and youth justice for 22 years, working in several local authorities in the UK. Susie? Thank you all so much. I think it's really important that you know who you're hearing from. So thank you for bearing with me through the bios. As we all know, the pandemic has presented particular challenges for those that are experiencing victimization, and particularly for those that are children and those that are domestic violence victims and survivors. It has been a deep concern to all of us on the panel, for those of us at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We have also done a brief survey of service providers to find out what the challenges are that they're facing trying to provide that service. But you'll hear different perspectives in regards to the findings that these fine folks have found. And particularly, again, as I stated before, how do we move forward addressing what's happened during the pandemic for domestic abuse survivors, domestic violence survivors, and how do we make sure that we have the best outcome for those that have experienced domestic violence, but not only them, also the advocates and service providers across the spectrum what is it that they need? What is it that they haven't been able to provide? And how do we make sure that we're addressing their needs and gaps as well? I read through very quickly. I must admit, it was a lot of reading, so I didn't get it, the in-depth stuff. But I think that you all will be so informed by our lovely panelists and what they have to offer on this particular issue. So thank you all so much for being here. With that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Bethany Backus, who will be our first presenter. Before Dr. Backus begins, I would ask that you remember to please mute. I know that on occasion I have accidentally hit the unmute button, which is a shocker to some. I would also encourage you, as I stated before, feel free to, even if you want to introduce yourself and say where you're from in the chat box, put your questions and or your quick intro in the chat box, and we'll do the best that we can to address those questions at the end. Dr. Backus?
Okay, is it showing up? Thumbs up?
Yes, it's beautiful.
Okay. You were gonna get that or a picture of my kids. So if that didn't show up. So thanks everyone for joining me and joining us this morning. And we're really excited to kind of talk about our preliminary results from this study. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit about perceptions and experiences of criminal justice personnel today. I have multiple screens up, so bear with me as I try to work this out. There it is. Okay, so the purpose of our study was really to understand the criminal justice experiences of criminal justice professionals. And one of the reasons for this is I had colleagues who were looking at community-based advocates, and there was a lot of work going on around kind of what law enforcement and prosecution was doing, but more broadly around cases not necessarily specific to domestic violence. And I also knew at the same time there were people who were looking at changes in calls, right? So collecting data on calls into hotlines and calls into police departments. And so I wanted to kind of look at what was happening in the field, on the ground for these folks, both people working in law enforcement, everyone from dispatch to patrol officers to leadership and prosecutors in court-based offices, and also those systems-based advocates that work with them or are assigned to work with them. So the way we did this, it was an online survey, and right now we've completed the online survey portion and we're doing semi-structured interview with a sample of those who participated in our online survey. We actually launched this on May 18th, and a week later after that, George Floyd was murdered in the United States by law enforcement. So at that point in time, we actually pulled back our recruitment and stopped the study. We didn't think it was appropriate to go out and be talking about this when there was other topics that we felt needed to be talked about. And we were doing mostly social media recruitment at that point in time. And so we kind of pulled back and then relaunched in early January, kind of after some of the election. It was an interesting year with lots of different events in the US. And so we went back out in January and have just kind of closed up and are starting to analyze our data now. And then we're conducting semi-structured interviews as an opt-in and doing participant referrals for that. So you can see in terms of our demographics, we primarily had women participating in our study. That was the bulk of it, and a primarily white population as well. And this average age was about 27 years of age, and then we get a range of people participating from 22 years of age to 70 years. In terms of agency affiliation, about 70% of those participating were affiliated with the law enforcement agency. That doesn't necessarily mean they were a law enforcement officer. It could mean that they're an advocate based within that agency. And then or a dispatcher or some other type of staff person at the law enforcement agency. And then about 30% were based at a prosecutor or district attorney's office in the US. In terms of areas served, the bulk of participants served kind of suburban areas, and they could say they serve more than one. Often people are working across multiple counties or jurisdictions, so they serve kind of suburban, about half serve an urban area, about 30% serve a major metropolitan area such as, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit, a major city. And about 9% served also provide services on American Indian reservations or villages, Alaska Native villages. So one of the things we wanted to get out particularly is, a lot of the narrative around COVID is, some people take it very seriously, some don't, some think it's a hoax. So we kind of wanted to do almost like a litmus test to see what folks were thinking. We took a few questions from the Gallup poll around COVID. And so one of those was asking, like, how serious do you think COVID was? And this was giving us a nice sense of the seriousness and that could help us maybe better understand some context to the answers. So about 47%, almost half, really thought it was very serious, and another 28% thought it was serious. There was only about 7% of folks that didn't think it was very serious. This was just helpful to us in understanding the sample's perspectives on COVID. The other thing we wanted to know was how confident people felt in their state's responses. Anyone who's followed some of the COVID, measures taken in the United States know that each state has basically implemented different responses. There's not been the one size fits all, and states have varied. And so this was also very interesting, but very few people were very confident in their state's response. So people were somewhat or not too confident, and then kind of a little bit that were not at all confident. So this is also helpful for us. And we have about 25 states represented in this study. So this is something we're hopefully going to dive in deeper to look at kind of maybe reasons behind this. We have some information on timing of lockdown orders and kind of different political affiliations and so on that we're seeing that start to come out too that might be impacting some people's perspectives on state responses. So once we understood that, we wanted to also know about whether the agencies had a specialized domestic violence unit. This could be within the law enforcement agency. So do they have some sort of a specialized unit like a domestic violence response team? And then also within the prosecutors unit, do they have like specialized attorneys or units that are focused on handling domestic violence cases? And so you can see about 47% of the sample has a DV unit. And of those, about 70% of those that have one are in it or a current member of their DV unit. So that tells me about half of our sample, or about half of our sample is has probably some specialized training on domestic violence because they're a member of the unit. And we also administered kind of some scaling questions around a domestic violence myth and acceptance, and also related to child abuse, but I'm not presenting those today. So for this presentation, I'm really going to focus on kind of changes in calls and cases and severity and kind of what's coming out of some of the qualitative questions we also asked. So if you see here, we looked at number of general calls and cases, and then we compared that to the number of domestic violence calls or cases. So about 29% of people reported that they had an increase in general calls or cases for just general calls and cases to the police. But we see about a 46% increase in domestic violence specific calls or cases. And I should have prefaced this early, but we're really defining domestic violence as intimate partner violence. For our study, we know there's been several studies out that are capturing domestic violence, kind of anything that's happening in the home. But we're calling it domestic violence because of the vernacular used at a lot of these agencies. But the way we define it in our study and in our interviews is as intimate partner violence or dating violence between partners. So we do see some increase in only about a 14% decrease in DV calls or cases here, and about 28%, a little less than a third, saying that they haven't seen changes. We did run some analyses on these, and there are significant differences in between general calls and the calls coming in related to intimate partner violence. So that's something we're going to try to look at a bit more as we move forward. And so to kind of elucidate some of this, I have some quotes in from some of the participants that talk about what they're seeing. So really the calls for service seem to be more common for domestic violence, also seeing an explosion of some of their sexual misconduct cases in terms of the amount of reporting abuse. And that was from a law enforcement officer in Michigan. The other thing that came up a lot was the fact that schools and daycares were closed. And a lot of reports usually came in through schools and daycares around intimate partner violence or anything happening with parents or families. And so a lot of people are saying by the time they get this information, it's actually really late. It's been happening for an extended period of time, or serious physical harm to the victim. And so this is something we've heard a couple times, and it's starting to also come out in our interviews that we're doing now. Advocates kind of noticed that they feel like they have more other types of DV cases, such as parent on adult children and children on parent cases. So this kind of came out in the open-ended questions, although we were focused on intimate partner violence, they're also seeing some of these. And then some people talking about an increase in female defendants, and they're not sure. We've been talking a little bit more about that in our interviews, and people aren't sure if just officers are not engaging as much, so they might be arresting both parties as opposed to just trying to find out who the primary aggressor is, or trying to do more investigation because they don't want to engage with people for fear of getting COVID. So this was also kind of an interesting thing that arose in our study. And then another person kind of pontificating that they feel like cases have been reduced, but it's not because it's domestic violence has reduced, but there's less amount of individuals go to substations after the attack. And one of the things we've heard from that specifically from the advocate point of view is that when they talk to people, they don't want to go places physically because they're afraid of getting sick. And so there's less kind of people going into police departments, other places to file or seeking out help that way. The other thing we wanted to look at was changes in protective orders and filings and perspectives on that. And so one of the things we saw was, filings seem to be staying the same. There's about like a third of people see an increase in the protective order filings. And some of that we're hearing is attributed to the process being easier to submit online. Some places have it really easy where you can submit online, kind of fillable form. Some don't have it that easy. And so I think it's kind of depending on that. And then we've also heard from some advocates that the survivors really like the fact that they don't have to go to court. They can do it remotely. They feel safer that way. And so they feel like more people have come forward to submit protective orders because of that. However, we also are seeing there's a lot of people reporting more violations. And some of this relates to what they're talking about is that the courts are moving very slow. So protective orders in case, but there's also criminal charges. But the courts are so backed up because of COVID or other things. And so there's reoffenses happening while they're waiting for something to be pursued within the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of frustration over these reoffenses happening in these violation of protective orders. This has also come out related to criminal no contact orders, where we've heard about people being released from prison and jails and different holdings because of COVID. And as one person said, oh, they slap an ankle monitor on them, but they don't have the people to follow up with the monitoring because there's so many people that they've released. And so they're seeing more violations of criminal no contact orders and also kind of protective order violations here. So, of course, the other thing that's coming up is kind of additional things in terms of distrust with law enforcement. Particularly, I think this is an ongoing issue within certain communities and has been exacerbated over the past 12 months. And so they're talking about this is a very challenging time for victims to seek police help when needed. And they feel like there's rumors that law enforcement are not arresting people or they're releasing people quickly due to jail overcrowding, which I'd mentioned before. And so this seems to be a very real concern for some of the folks that are working in prosecution and advocacy. So in terms of the change in severity of DV calls and cases, we've heard some mixed findings on these. About a third of people have said that the severity has increased. So we're hearing more about more strangulation or restriction of airway type of injuries. But they're also concerned that officers aren't able to assess these at the scene because they're not necessarily going into the house, or they're just talking to one person outside with some of these changes in practice and policies. But we're kind of seeing some of this come out in some of the narrative in terms of the severity and people seeing more firearms in houses and having to try to do more with the court orders to get the firearms removed from the houses. That seems to be a concern for the few of the advocates that we've talked to and that have chimed in on some of the qualitative pieces of the study. So this is a quote from a district attorney in Florida. So having less school and less community activities has made it harder to know about the things going on with the child at home. So many of the DV victims that have come in have cited kind of COVID and the stress related to COVID as a reason for the escalation of violence. And it's unclear how true it is, but they also feel like COVID might be used as a way to deflect also, to saying, I'm not going to come into court because of COVID, that there might be some coercive control happening in some aspects of it, to say, don't go to court, or the perpetrator's kind of in the house. So they feel like they just know less because people aren't out. And so that was kind of a concern throughout the study as well. Some issues about child abuse came up too in this, and we ended up adding a few questions about child abuse in the second, when we relaunched the survey in January, just because of the school closures and people kind of talking about child abuse in the first phase of the study, and saying kind of this lack of access to families through the children, and things like this. And so they are saying, some of them are also saying, in tandem with some of the domestic violence cases, they're also seeing an increase in severity of child abuse cases. And normally they would be able to figure these out earlier because of schools or other types of reporting options. And so they did notice the severity increase with families who've had domestic violence and or child abuse history. So they're starting to see some of the same families again. And we've heard that in some of our recent interviews too, that they're seeing some of the same people more often that they've helped before, along with new people, but the reoffenses and kind of seeing the same people with more severe injuries and issues has definitely been a trend they're seeing. We asked about their perceptions of victim safety, and most, about half, said they think that safety has decreased a lot for victims since COVID started, and then kind of about 38% said safety has decreased a little since COVID, and only about 14% thought that safety has stayed the same. So I think we are interested in looking at this a little bit more in terms of where people rank on the domestic violence myth and acceptance scale in terms of their perceptions around safety and some of these other issues too, as we kind of take a deeper dive into the data. One thing, so I know this is a big table, so I'll try to walk through this a little bit in depth, but we did ask about what strategies are you using most often to help survivors and talk to them. And so if you look at some of these, the main strategy, and these are kind of in descending order. So encouraging them to call the police, which is, we're working with a criminal justice sample here. So it's not surprising that that's the highest percentage. I would expect that from a criminal justice focus sample. They also are suggesting they file an emergency injunction or protective order, encouraging them to stay in another home or residence, encouraging them to develop a safety plan, and offering emergency shelters or other housing programs. Now, about 46% of people are offering these emergency shelter housing programs, but what we also are hearing from the field is that they don't have as much availability in terms of shelter beds or housing because of COVID, because they've had to reduce capacity. But we've also had talked to some people who are doing some innovative things around trying to get more houses and just more people into homes through vouchers or through HUD, things like that. And Ruth just let me know I have 5 minutes left, so I will be wrapping up soon. And then there's some other things. So we did think it was interesting that they were helping or encouraging them to develop a safety plan. And conducting a danger risk assessment was like about 31%. But I think we're interested in doing a deeper dive here in terms of they're recommending these strategies, but are survivors actually using them or doing these recommendations that they have. And we're interested in diving a little bit deeper related to the access to emergency shelter and housing, and some of the issues around protective orders and if people are getting them. So kind of wrapping up real quick, some of the barriers to access that we really saw for here, you can see the housing and health services. So what we're hearing kind of loud and clear is that really people are not willing to leave their home, and they're not willing to go seek shelter or get new housing for fear of getting COVID. At the same time, there was also concerns that there weren't enough beds or weren't enough safe places for housing, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when we knew a lot less about how it was transmitted and different safety precautions we could take. And then at the same time, they're very concerned about medical treatment. people are not going to doctors or hospitals because one, they feel that they feel like they're overwhelmed and they feel like my issue isn't as important as them treating these patients for COVID. And so I'm not going to be going to get help. And so there is concern about less people going to seek medical care as well during COVID. And then in terms of barriers to leaving the abuser, a lot of concerns about whether someone can afford to leave. So can they afford to get housing? Right now we have this stay on evictions, and there's a lot of back pay building up for people to have to pay their rent. And so there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen, and that it's really hard with unemployment and inability for people to necessarily work their jobs, or job loss during COVID is how are they going to leave them? And then kind of this issue of their children at home with them all day. So they might be able to do more with their children not at home to potentially find a home or something, but with their children at home and having to take on these extra childcare responsibilities, it's a little bit harder for them to be able to relocate from their abuser. So these are some things to follow up, that they don't see them physically in their office, and they just feel the victims are more afraid and more reluctant to seek services and alternative housing. And so just a quick summary, because I know Ruth is probably telling me that my time is up, just about 1 minute. So summary of our findings, preliminary, and again, these are very preliminary. We just closed the survey a month ago and are just still looking into some of this, is that we definitely are seeing an increased calls and severity of DV incidents. There's a lack of reporting or ability to identify domestic violence due to school closures. There's a perception that victim safety has greatly decreased during COVID. And there's a reduced access to and availability of services due to COVID and social political activities of the last year. Our next steps is to continue doing these semi-structured interviews. We've developed some infographics that I uploaded into the file section of this presentation, and we're going to continue to kind of work on some reports and infographics for stakeholders, and start to dive deeper and look for funding to do a deeper dive of some of the organizational impacts victim service agencies, criminal justice agencies are experiencing during COVID. So thank you. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me. My contact information, the slides are uploaded into the file section as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Backus, otherwise known as Bethany to me. Very informative, and I'm sure that our participants will make use of that information, and can't wait to see what the next steps are and how they unfold. Just a reminder, please mute your mic. I do hear background noise from somewhere, probably me, but let's make sure that we're muted. With that said, remember also to put your questions in the chat, and/or hold on to those burning questions to the end, so we'll make sure that we respond to those. So with no further ado, it is our opportunity to hear from Dr. Richard and Dr. Nix, also known as Tamara, Kara, and Justin to me. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to them. Could somebody please mute there? Thank you. Okay, it's yours.
Bethany, can you see my slides? Ruth, can you see my slides?
Yes, they're beautiful. Justin, you're still on mute, and just a reminder when you get ready to unmute.
Wonderful. So today we're going to be sharing a new project with you guys. It's been some ongoing work that Justin and I have been working on for maybe 5 or 6 months now. So today we're sharing a comparison of 911 and emergency hotline calls for domestic violence, both before and during COVID-19. Oh, let me just acknowledge my other co-authors, Scott and Ian, who are in the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah. Without their just amazing statistical skills, this work would not be possible. So Scott and Ian, if you're watching this, thank you, thank you, thank you. So we really approached this study after analyzing police calls for service data. So Justin and I were really following the lead of Alex Picchiro, and other criminologists who have been examining DV-related police calls for service during COVID-19 and finding these increases in DV help seeking to police really directly after stay-at-home orders. So Justin and I also looked at 6 jurisdictions and found increases in DV-related police calls for service, really, again, directly after those stay-at-home orders. So seeing spikes in March and April of 2020, and thinking about other ways to capture information on DV help seeking, because we all know that most victims of domestic violence don't actually call the police. So by relying solely on police calls for service, we're probably missing important information on DV help seeking. So we thought that it would be a really good idea to try to look at both police calls for service and calls to emergency hotlines for the same jurisdictions, and see if patterns in calls for police service, calls to emergency hotlines, both or neither changed, and if there were changes, did those changes match in terms of the direction and the intensity of the changes. So here in this study, we were looking to examine the observed trends in DV calls for service to police and emergency hotlines before and during COVID-19. So when we talk about observed trends, we mean what actually happened. So looking at the data over time and plotting, the number of calls for service and looking at that trajectory. We also wanted to look at the expected trends, which in the social sciences we call the counterfactual. So what we would have expected to happen if not for some event. And the event we're interested in here is COVID-19, or more particularly those stay-at-home orders, right? Or the social distancing, the social isolation that folks started engaging in as a health precaution. So here we wanted to look at, again, based on what we knew about 2018 and 2019 calls for service, what would we have expected to happen in the spring and summer and fall of 2020 if not for COVID-19? And after we estimated that observed trend and that expected trend, were there any differences, right? So were there differences in what we observed and what we would have expected to happen if not for COVID-19? So we approached these questions by looking at data from 7 US cities: Baltimore, Maryland; Cincinnati, Ohio; Hartford, Connecticut; Orlando, Florida; Sacramento, California; Salt Lake City, Utah; and St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, our sampling design does allow for pretty wide regional variation, but it's also a product of data availability. So we started by looking at the Police Data Initiative, which for folks who do policing research, if you don't know about this, it's very, very cool. So it's really open police data. So calls for service to law enforcement departments in cities across the United States, and not just major cities. So we started there to see what cities were posting their data in real time or near to real time. And of those cities, which cities specified DV calls for service, right? Because we needed to parse out domestic violence calls. So once we really had our sample of jurisdictions that provided these data, we needed to get those emergency hotline calls. So we looked at the set of jurisdictions, and I thought about folks that I knew in those jurisdictions. And, honestly, I just started cold calling victim service agencies and sending emails and explaining that I was, a gender-based violence researcher at UNO, that my colleague and I wanted to do this work, that we thought it would be really helpful to the field, to practitioners, and to those organizations themselves. and would they be interested in collaborating with us? And we're so grateful. We had not just participation, but really enthusiastic participation from agencies in these 7 cities. And they, provided us timely data, and sometimes it took several iterations. So, while they're already carrying this burden of COVID-19 and trying to provide services to their clients, they also, were happy to work with us. So again, if you're listening, thank you, thank you. So again, police calls for service and emergency hotline calls. And our study period was January 1st, 2018 through October 31st, 2020. However, when we talk about the COVID period or the COVID related period, we're really talking about March 9th through October 31st. That March 9th date was chosen because there's been several social science papers that have been published that identified that March 9th is really when people started changing their behavior. So Leslie and Wilson in particular, who are econometricians, they did some really cool analysis looking at open table reservation data and mobile cell phone location data, and really pinpointing this date as the date where things really changed. So again, March 9th through October 31st, 2020 is our COVID related period. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Justin Nix, to talk about the analyses.
Thanks, Tara. And, so Tara did a great job really explaining the purpose of our study and how we approach the analyses. But just as a quick reminder, we're really interested in, the observed data that we saw over a nearly 3-year period. Oops, if you could back up, yeah. And, the challenge with this research is to estimate what would have happened in a world where COVID didn't occur. And that's obviously not possible, but the best we can do is to construct a synthetic counterfactual. So, we take 2 years worth of data from 2018 and 2019, and we use Bayesian structural time series models to estimate what might have occurred in 2020 absent the pandemic. And so that's the expected trend that we're going to be comparing the observed data to. And this allows us to calculate the differences between the 2 trends across our entire sample and individually within each jurisdiction. And that's important because these data, daily call data can be pretty noisy. Calls bounce around as a function of seasonal variation, or whether there's a home professional sports game that day, et cetera. And so, Leslie and Wilson, in fact, who Tara referenced, estimate with their study of 14 cities that if you don't account for seasonal variation, you could overestimate the COVID effect by a factor of 2 or more. So it's really important to look at a wider span of data as we've done here. So next slide. And I'll mention, Tara and I have uploaded our slides at the link that I just dropped in the chat. So I'm going to kind of run through this. There's a lot here. Rather than bombard you with 15 slides worth of results, we thought we would just sort of crystallize it down to 2 charts. But you can go online and flip through and zoom in if you like. But basically, here's what we saw, where if you look at that sort of tealish greenish line, the solid line, that's the observed data, right? That's the call data that was sent to us from the victim service agencies and the calls for service data that we downloaded from the Police Data Initiative. And then that yellowish goldish line is that synthetic counterfactual that we estimated. And so you can see the difference post that vertical dash line, which represents March 9th, as Tara explained, is the start of the COVID period. And so each panel of the graph kind of summarizes what happened in each city. So for example, in Baltimore, Sacramento, and Salt Lake City, we saw sustained increases. That green line goes up post-COVID. And I believe across all three, it's also higher than what we estimate would have occurred absent the pandemic. So there's a lot of variation within jurisdictions. Post-COVID, we saw anywhere from 1 to 7 more calls per day on average. And across the sample of 7 cities, that adds up to about 1,030 more calls to police during the COVID period. And we have other charts that we could share if anyone's interested, where we really compare the difference between the counterfactual and the observed, and you could go into each city and see what the difference was. Because it's also important to point out here that although every city saw an increase in the observed data, there were a couple of cities, Hartford and Cincinnati, for example, where the increase was actually less than we expect would have occurred. And so there are some very interesting differences here across jurisdictions. Okay, so next slide, Tara. This next graph is going to be the emergency hotline data. And so same basic premise here, where you're looking at the green line is the observed data, the gold line is the counterfactual data that we estimated. And here the story isn't so clean. There's a little more, the story isn't as consistent, right? We see some cities saw an increase in emergency hotline calls, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Hartford. And these increases were a little less pronounced, anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 more calls per day on average, but a net total across the sample of nearly 1,700 more calls during the COVID period. And you can see in places like Sacramento, for example, there's a huge gap between what we estimate would have occurred absent the pandemic and what actually occurred. Same thing in St. Petersburg. And I think another thing that's interesting here is to look at the trends over time. A lot of the early work that Tara referenced in the setup to this was focused on that immediate aftermath of stay-at-home orders. Here we're looking at longer term trends, and we can see, for example, if you look at Cincinnati, there's a brief spike followed by a decline starting in the summertime. So this analysis allows us to look at longer term trends. It wasn't just stay-at-home orders that may have caused a change in domestic violence patterns or help seeking for domestic violence. It was all of the stressors, all of the uncertainty, the prolonged economic impact of the pandemic. So one last slide, I think, for me, and then I'll turn it back over to Tara. The idea again here is to compare jurisdictions to one another and to compare within jurisdictions what really happened versus what we think might have happened without the pandemic. And again, tip of the hat to Ian and Scott for their help doing these counterfactuals. But the big picture takeaway is that there were increases in calls for domestic violence, help seeking for domestic violence across both data sources, right? So with official and unofficial data, we kind of arrive at the same conclusion, which is help seeking increased. But there was variation across the sample in terms of whether that increase was seen in calls to the police, calls to emergency hotlines, or both. I think this drives home the point of the importance of, keeping in mind when we talk about national statistics or even statewide statistics about really any kind of crime data or victimization data. But when we're talking about domestic violence, be wary of saying, oh, it's up, 8% nationwide, or it's up 10% statewide, because even in our sample, we have data from Orlando and St. Petersburg, and the data tell very different stories. So I think, again, takeaways from our study include to just remember that crime and victimization are local, right? And so it's important. It's not unimportant to look at national or state level trends, but just don't let that take precedent over what's going on the ground, right? Agencies are collecting very rich, very detailed data. And in some cases, more and more frequently, we're seeing police departments share it in near real time. So that can really inform what's going on the ground. So again, a lot of variation across the sample in terms of what cities experienced. It's important to keep in mind some of the differences might be explained by seasonality or things that weren't pandemic related. So it's important to construct the counterfactual and compare. So anyway, for a discussion of what this all means and the takeaways and implications, I'll kick it back over to Tara. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. So sort of big picture, what Justin and I conclude is that, as expected, police calls only tell us part of the story about DV help seeking during COVID-19. Emergency hotlines and victim service agencies and advocates shoulder a lot of the burden, right? Are shouldering a lot of the burden. Justin gave you those net totals, right? So about 1,000 more calls to police, about 1,600 more calls to victim service agencies than would be expected, but that's net. So that also, that in that total are the jurisdictions that saw those decreases. When we look at victim service agencies in particular, I think it was about 6,000 more calls than would have been expected across the agencies that just saw an increase, right? So I mean, these in some of these agencies, they were seeing 800, 900, 1,000 more calls than would have been expected during that COVID-related period. And that's at the same time where, they're trying to switch to remote work, and they're trying to take services that are usually provided in person into a virtual platform, and they're, trying to figure out internet connectivity for their clients. And most of them didn't get this tidal wave of cash to help support all of these new things that they needed to do. So, I really think that we want to take this opportunity to really just say, like, we see you, we recognize you, because one of the things that we really noticed from doing this work is there's a real paucity of studies on emergency hotlines in the literature. And so, it's not as, I think, apparent to researchers and perhaps even policymakers the extent to which emergency hotlines serve victims, because there's just not this tidal wave of research saying, look at all these increases to emergency hotlines. And, one of the reasons for that is that, the data is just not as widely available. So as Justin mentioned, it really is important for us to be thinking about the issue of domestic violence and domestic violence help seeking as a local problem with localized impacts on agencies. Because just because Orlando saw that decrease in calls for service, that does not negate the huge increase that St. Petersburg saw in their victim service agencies, emergency hotlines, right? So if I was, a policymaker in Florida, I really need to have both of those, both information, both sets of information, so that I can, provide resources across the state, in the best, the best, most efficient way. We also think that it's really important, to highlight the fact that, as vaccines roll out and as mask mandates are lifted, and, hopefully with the COVID relief bill, we really do start to see COVID recede, this pandemic within a pandemic, right? So as the United Nations and, physicians across the globe have called, domestic violence really that shadow pandemic, or that pandemic within a pandemic, that the underlying factors, the economic stressors that are associated with domestic violence, those things are not going to be as, quickly or easily resolved. So we really need, I think, to harness this focused attention that we've seen on domestic violence help seeking during COVID-19. We need to, really harness this and use it to try to put pressure on policymakers to make real change, and to make sure that change is sustained, right? And it's not fleeting, as we start to see, COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. So finally, Justin and I have really been thinking about this culture of data sharing and data access. So clearly, victim service agencies have, important concerns about confidentiality and privacy for their clients, and that, that is a critical, important, issue to have in mind. But given, the proliferation of coordinated community response teams and this desire and emphasis on interagency collaboration to respond to domestic violence, it really may be time to think about how victim service agency data could be used along with law enforcement data. And, you can think about local healthcare, emergency room data, for example, de-identified in the aggregate, right? But how it could be used together to really advance more data-driven decision-making for local jurisdictions. So you could think about perhaps if there was a way for victim service agencies and law enforcement agencies that sit on those community response teams to be sharing their data or considering their data together in more real, of a real time way, how they would have seen those changes, those trends, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And if, for example, law enforcement calls for service in that jurisdiction had decreased, but hotlines, calls had increased, they would have had a better picture about what was happening in their jurisdiction and happening in their community. So, a great place for us really to end is, with, sort of that, the brainstorming, if you will, as we're thinking about, reimagining policing in the United States, and thinking about how we can advance better responses to domestic violence, given that COVID has really shown us the limitations in responding to domestic violence, and pivoting, when there is when there's a problem, right? And it could be a pandemic, or it could be the other social and political unrest that we've seen, of recent. Really thinking about, those limitations and how can we, create change and create sustained change moving forward. So here's our references, and again, our slides are available under the files for the presentation. And I'll just leave you with our information, and also a link to Justin's blog, where you can find all of our analyses and working papers and the things that have been published, if you're interested in sort of knowing more and following updates on what we're doing with this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richards, Dr. Nix. What great information. And I particularly appreciated the comment in regards to how it's local, and we've got to make sure that even when there's a national response or whatever that we're addressing, how to make sure that the local community can operate within whatever that might be. So probably not a surprise to most of us, but important to remember, correct? So thank you so much. With that said, just a reminder that we're taking questions in the chat box. Please know that we'll also have some time at the end to respond to questions. So we won't be responding to them immediately. And then a reminder, please, to also always check to make sure you're on mute, so that the presentations can be heard and we minimize distractions. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Anil and Dr. Kinjial. I hope I said that right. Please correct me, Mahanu.
And that's fine, Ruth. It's Kanjilal. Yeah, you were quite close.
Okay, as long as I was close. So thank you so much to the both of you, and we look forward to hearing what you've found.
It's also Susan Hawkes.
Oh, and
so it's myself, Elaine Arnold, Mahuya, and Susie.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. So we're going to be talking about, it fits very nicely with the two presentations that just
Elaine, I think you muted yourself.
apparently I was muted by the host. Ruth was bored by me already. No worries. Yes, I'll start again. I think we fit very nicely with the two presentations that have gone before, in that we have been looking at how families have been able to be supported by a domestic violence agency, in the way that they've had to adapt their practice during COVID-19. And that picks up on some of the things about both local adaptation and practices that Justin and Tara were talking about, but also quite a lot of similarities with Bethany that I noticed and thought would be interesting to reflect on at the end. So this research was undertaken by me, by Mahuya Kanjilal and Susan Hawkes from the University of Wolverhampton, and we did so working with Living with Abuse, and the chief exec from Living with Abuse, Debbie Hughes, is in the audience, and she's also going to be joining us for the last slide to talk about the implications of this research. And Living with Abuse are an organisation that we've been working with in Leicestershire for a long time now, over a good couple of years, actually around a whole range of research projects about how we conceptualise violence, how violence is measured, and also around child to parent violence or child to other violence. So and we're also working, I worked previously at the Nottingham Trent University, and we're working with colleagues from there. So this is one part of a whole big project that involves lots of different bits to it. Would you give me the next slide, Mahuya, please? So the background to this research was that we really wanted to understand the way that the way COVID-19 had impacted services aimed at supporting families with domestic violence and abuse. And that's because living with abuse does actually offer a range of services, both to children, principally to women and mothers, but also to male victims. So it offers a whole range of services. And those services can be very high risk services. They're based in police stations, and then they're also refuges. So it's a very wide range of services on offer. And what we've tried to reflect on in this, it's a qualitative study, is we've tried to reflect very much on areas of innovation and where practice has changed and how people feel they've been able to respond positively, and where they've been able to, where that hasn't been, they've had a lot of challenges. And that was very much because we wanted to focus on how adaptive services have been able to be, because that's what we'd observed, was that people were responding very fast to a growing situation, and quite often not necessarily, as Tara was talking about, always getting the credit or the funding for that. So we wanted to be able to reflect some of that in terms of what was going on. So this is an ongoing study that will also involve social workers and looking at the way they have adapted their practice, but this piece is just with the Domestic Violence Agency. That's me.
Thanks, Elaine. This is a qualitative study, as Elaine just mentioned, and as a method, we did semi-structured interviews and one-to-one, quite in-depth interviews with our participants. So we had total 21 participants from Living Without Abuse, which is a domestic violence and abuse organization, frontline organization in England. And today we are presenting our early findings from the first round of interviews. Because of COVID restrictions, we did the interview online using Team platform. And we had 15 practice-related questions and 9 demographic questions about the participants. So we then analyzed each interview's coded, and themes are identified to show the impacts on practice. Next slide, please, Susie. Thank you. So the demographic compositions of our participants shows that the majority of our participants came from white British ethnic background, and the second major group comprises of British Asian ethnic background. And age distribution shows that 57% of our participants are aged between 30 and 50, and 1/3 of our participants aged over 50s. Next slide, please. So work experience-wise, our participants are quite highly experienced. If you can see from this pie chart, that half of them worked in the similar role over 6 years, and actually 30% of total respondents have more than 15 years of experience. They're quite highly experienced group of people. And majority of our participants are victim support worker. We also had participation from violence prevention worker and from senior management level. So we tried to capture a range of practice experience which are related to their job roles. Next slide, please. So when we analyzed the data, we tried to find what are the changes happened in their practice on the surveys, and how those changes are impacting impacting those practitioners, and how those changes are impacting on service users. So we tried to find out some positive impacts on practice, positive impacts on service user, similarly negative impacts on practice and negative impacts on service user. So here in this slide, you can see some quotation from our participants, which is representing the themes we have found on positive impacts on practice. And some of the themes include that online group activity actually really effective for practices. So they said virtual sessions are really working well. It saves travel time. And also they are working, they are doing more work within that similar, same time, scheduled time, and they are taking more caseloads as well. And it's not only saving travel time, it's also saves cost because they don't have to hire venues. So it's really effective in a way. And that leads to also better work-life balance, which is positive from their perspective as well. And one other thing is really interesting to see that the services are reaching more wider areas, especially rural areas and remote areas, which they may be not able to do before because of online. They are now reaching service users from remote areas and offering them more options, which is fantastic for the services as well. And one other theme came out, a positive theme came out from the interviews is multi-agency working is really going well during this time. Because of virtual working, people are meeting multi-agency meetings, are attending multi-agency meeting, and from other organizations, they're attending team meetings and sharing their resources, sharing the information, which is absolutely helping multi-agency working. And similar sort of theme, it supports same sort of comments came that we had a lot of police calls like immediate attention needed, really good responses from police. So they had good, quick responses from police, again, showing how multi-agency working is effective during this time. And also our participants have said that the online working is a little bit safer because they are dealing with sensitive issues. So yeah, these are the positive themes came out, and these are impacts on practice. And my colleague Susie will talk about other themes. Over to you, Susie.
Okay, thank you, Mahuya. So in terms of the positive impacts upon service users, some of these the themes that came out in relation to service users mirror the positive impacts upon staff. So there was a general feeling that some of the online groups, the domestic violence sort of support groups and groups for victims of domestic violence, that they were a positive innovation for a significant number of people. So they found that it was useful by doing the groups online. They were able, it was a lot more convenient, reflecting the feedback from from the practitioners that they were getting more people to go, because people who were remote were finding it easier to attend the groups. There was less travel time for them involved. They could just turn on their computer, attend the group, and turn their computer off again, and they were back in their homes with no traveling left to do. In a similar way, they found that being online meant that they had more control over the session. So when they got to a point where they were not enjoying or finding the session difficult, that they could just turn off the computer and they could leave much more easily. And again, in a similar vein, that given the restrictions that COVID-19 had placed upon people, in terms of the restrictions imposed by government, particularly school closures, it meant that the online working or the working over the telephone meant that they could continue to receive a service and continue with their childcare at the same time. They didn't need to find somebody else to come and babysit while they went off to either attend an appointment or to attend a group. For some people. They highlighted that the lockdown restrictions had helped them in terms of reducing the access that the perpetrator had to them, and sometimes that COVID-19 had resulted in the contact with children, between children and perpetrators being stopped, which some victims had found really helpful. And finally, that they had highlighted that they felt safer. Some service users highlighted they felt safer discussing the sensitive subjects of domestic violence and domestic abuse and the things that they had been experiencing in the privacy of their own home. They felt a little safer in their own homes discussing it online and over the telephone. So, sorry. Sorry, pressed it twice. So in terms of the negative impacts on practice, so these are the difficulties that practitioners had with adapting to COVID and the changes that were put in place. That they found that online, that they were struggling sometimes with some people to pick up on the other forms of communication that people use when when practitioners use working with victims of domestic violence. That they found sometimes that people talked about sometimes that when victims weren't entirely honest about what was going on or what had been happening, things like being able to observe damage to the house online, that could be easily hidden, and they couldn't always detect things like body language to unpick really whether they thought people were being entirely honest. That they had found, I can't see the top thing, and I don't know whether I can get rid of the bar. Oh, sorry, the bar. That there had been an increase in referrals, and in particular parts of the service, not that they weren't reflected equally across all different service areas, but in some areas of the service, as Elaine said, that there are different, living with abuse have different services, some for children, some for adolescents, as adolescent victims, some for children as witnesses to domestic violence, some for befriending services, or different types of service. But for particularly the service in the police that was based in the police station, they had found some significant increases in referrals at particular points in the COVID time period, particularly after restrictions had been released, which had meant that they were not able to respond to referrals in the way that they previously had. That similarly to the one mentioned in the beginning, that feedback from children had been identified as something that was difficult to get online, that practitioners felt that when working with children, face-to-face sessions were better than working with them online. Some children obviously were better than others, but maintaining the attention of children what was tricky when using online platforms. Practitioners also found that for some service users, they found virtual Zoom sessions a barrier, that some people didn't like seeing their face on the screen, didn't like seeing themselves reflected back to them, and this was a barrier to undertaking and engaging in the work. Practitioners found it took quite a lot longer to build up relationships with service users. Again, that was linked to the not being able to sort of engage with people on all sort of fronts in terms of body language and seeing the environment and perhaps engaging in the small talk. And there were some practitioners who had said that when they had seen on the occasions, the rare occasions they had seen service users in person, so to drop off food parcels and things, that what they'd found is immediately after that there'd been an increase in engagement, and that they felt that they attributed that increase in engagement to having met them face to face, even though it was at a distance. And again, similarly, building up a rapport, especially with children, was very difficult online. Some of the negative impacts on service users. I think the thing that came out across the board was the impact on mental health. That a lot of practitioners mentioned that they'd seen a deterioration in mental health. And some practitioners, one practitioner that I interviewed said that she was really worried that actually if it carried on like this, the levels of mental health, high level mental health, that she wasn't sure she would be able to cope. Fortunately, it did subside a little bit, but I think that was something that was reflected across the interviews, the increase in mental health problems, which had negatively impacted upon service users. It was so some people had found that perpetrators were using COVID restrictions in an abusive way, so that they were doing things, they were using the COVID restrictions in ways that were abusive, and perhaps would not have previously been perhaps considered as a domestic violence behaviour. So, for example, insisting on tests before children were returned home, prolonging contact, stopping contact from happening. In terms of physical violence, there had been, it seems that from our interviews, that there had been an escalation in some of the intensity and of the violence itself that was happening, that there had been an increase in the severity of it in some cases, and that there'd been an increase in child on parent abuse, which is perhaps not surprising given how long some of the children had been away from school. And some people had found that being locked in the house, that victims were kept in the house with perpetrators, and so that they were finding it difficult to access support. And finally, in terms of negative impacts on service users, we had, this is a quote, "Just trying to keep staff well is quite traumatic. Obviously, things are discussing particularly some sort of sexual violence teams, you know, sitting in your spare room or bedroom or whatever, bring those conversations, really quite horrific stories into your home." So I think that's actually an impact on the members of staff, but that was the bringing of the work into the home, and then staff not having an outlet for that. So that is the last slide on that. So I'm passing over to Elaine.
Sorry, I've muted myself there. As you can see, there are some things that have both a negative and a positive connotation in them, and that's what we really found. So in terms of service innovations, it was amazing to us really how quickly people adapted and found new ways to practice, and were able in restrained financial circumstances and everything to respond so quickly. So online evening sessions to support service users were found to be really great, because people didn't have to travel, they felt safer and all of those sorts of things, whilst also for some people that became quite difficult, but people adapted to this really quickly. Oh, thank you, Ruth. And then in terms of starting actually a new service during this period. So actually finding the time and the energy and the resources, and the new service was a befriending service, and it made use of volunteers within the organisation who usually work there, who weren't able to do the things they normally did, but actually could begin to just ring people up and check in with them, or text them and check if they were okay, without having to give away who they were from or where they were based. And people found that really useful, and particularly in terms of supporting people in terms of mental health and other things, because of one of the things that Bethany spoke about and that we found was this lack of access to your normal mechanisms of support, which might be normally just chatting with other parents at the school gates, or one of the examples given to us was one woman, the only place she was allowed to go out to normally was her GP surgery, and she had a meeting there every single week usually, where she met with the domestic violence organisation, whereas her husband thought she was meeting a medical person, and she wasn't allowed to do that anymore because the doctor's surgery wasn't open. So things like the befriending service stepped in, and although at distance, was able to give some support to people. And Debbie, who's with us next, may talk about this, the availability of funding and the easier access to funding. Certainly one of the things the organisation found was that having had quality codes and kite marks, we call them in the UK, for various aspects of their work, which guarantee a quality, that although you might usually apply for those and have them in position, actually you're still usually asked to evidence all the sorts of things you do around quality. Whereas actually during this era, when, because of the focus on domestic violence and the increases in domestic violence and people's concerns about it, actually government and other funding bodies started to release funds, and particularly did so on the basis of whether you already had these other quality and kite marks. So for them, it was quite an important thing to learn for the future as well. I'm just going to try and move this because I can't read the bottom one. Here we go. So, and the other one was the multi-agency working. Now, what we found was that for some people this worked better, and for some people it didn't. We think where staff were more experienced or more used to being in that era, they were able to work more effectively with the agencies they already had, and that they got to know one another better, because actually everybody always turned up to the meetings because they were in their house. Will you knock it on, Susie, for me, please? In terms of the modification of its in practice, people did have to actually create online resources for group activities, and our colleagues at Nottingham Trent University actually created a package for using with children as part of this service. So there were quite big modifications to practice, and people having to think and relearn the ways that they worked. There was the cost of hiring venues, worked very well because it saves them costs, though maybe not so much for the venues. And for some people, they found they had a flexible online working gave them a better work-life balance. The organisation also, though, found that it had to set up a buddy system for staff to support one another, partly because they had new staff come on board who didn't know anybody at the organisation. We've certainly had that ourselves. In fact, both Mahuya and Susie have joined the University of Wolverhampton during COVID. This buddy system allowed people to work with one another and support one another and get to know one another, and gave people the opportunity to have somebody to just call to discuss the difficulties and the things that were going on. So there are some of those things that people felt that they'll probably keep going. And the quote was that it really is an extra string to the bow that will change practice because people have discovered new things. Would you give us the last slide, Susie? And I think Debbie's going to join me. I think she's going to unmute. So this extra string to your bow, one of the things we thought was that really this was about working out what the gains and benefits were that would stay, and what people would be able to do. So Debbie, are you there?
I am here. Sorry, I've realised the sun is hugely behind me, so it looks like some kind of angelic being with a halo. So apologies, I don't think there's much point in me having my video on, but yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Know if you wanted to say anything about, as a service, what you think some of the gains were for you and benefits, and what things may remain.
Yeah, I think you've referred to quite a few of them, you know, sort of the innovative pieces of work that have come out of it that we would maintain. So the befriending service would certainly be one of them. It's something that we talked about doing for a long time. Has been a useful sort of asset when people maybe are coming out of service and they're just not quite ready for support to end completely. They still need that comfort. There's a contact there, or if they're on waiting lists, someone to stay in touch with them. But the reason it came out so quickly during the COVID period was because, as you mentioned, we've got some really highly experienced staff, and their job is really to discuss the domestic abuse situation that's going on, and talk through that, and their action plans, their support plans around dealing with the domestic abuse. What we found was lockdown was actually people did not want to talk about the domestic abuse that they were experiencing. They wanted to talk about the restrictions, the lockdown, what it was like trying to teach their children at home, all of those things, and they couldn't actually think at any in that time around the abuse that they were experiencing. So we felt that by having somebody else that they could chat to just generally about life and those things actually freed up capacity for our paid staff, our outreach workers, victim support workers, to actually deal then with the domestic abuse, whether that's taken through orders, going to court, whatever it might be, dealing with their housing, child contact, all sorts of domestic abuse specific issues, while discussing what's going on with COVID and people's fears and anxieties about that. The befrienders were able to give them time to discuss those things. So that will definitely stay. That's been really useful now. That's all up and running. The buddy system has also been really popular with staff, and it was because we were really conscious of how much or how important peer support is within our teams. So everyone gets supervision, they get clinical supervision, there's all sorts of processes in place to try and keep staff well, but actually a huge amount of that support is that having a chat for 10 minutes with their peers, or if they're having a bad day, or if they're hitting a dead end and they've got barriers, just having, turning to someone else in the office and having a chat for 5 minutes is, some really constructive use of their time. So by buddying people up and just encouraging them, within the week to take a coffee break and chat to somebody else, it made sure that our staff was getting to know each other, like we mentioned, new staff, but also that, that level of support, that peer support still existed. So that will continue, and then really the online group work will continue. In any one time we've probably got between 10 and 15 groups running across our area, and at the moment, or through the majority of lockdown, we've had 2 physical face-to-face groups being able to meet and socially distance, and the rest have been online, various online options. So we hope that pendulum will swing back and we'll have more face-to-face groups in the future, but we'll always have at least 1 or 2 online versions running for those people who, like I said, it's a very rural area, some of our region, or just very difficult for people to access groups, or people just very anxious about going into new buildings that they don't know and things like that. So we're going to keep that as an option long term, that they can choose to do that if that's their preferred way of meeting. So there's certainly been some really good lessons learned that we can make use of in the long term.
Thanks, Debbie. And I think Ruth would like us to draw to a close. So maybe they might be things that people might want to talk to us about. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies, so much. What great information we've gotten during this panel discussion. Currently, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm going to give some closings and then certainly welcome the panelists if they have questions of other panelists, or they have some closing remarks to certainly to jump in. So I think that we have learned, to no surprise, what the impact is on not only survivors, but their children, the communities in which they live, the service providers. I prefer to call them service programs because they range so wide. And what I find most fascinating about what we've learned from you all today is that what we thought was a problem before in regards to domestic violence has become another type of shadow pandemic. I do believe firmly from what we've gained and heard anecdotally from advocates and those that are providing those service provisions is that unfortunately, as we move away from the pandemic and become to feel safer moving around in our own worlds, we will probably see an increase in domestic violence cases. And I mean that by saying those that report. What we've heard is that even during, even if they had the survivors, because, you know, I'm always speaking from a survivor perspective, but even if survivors had before the pandemic were doing their own internal planning about how they might get to safety and figuring out their lives and that kind of thing, the pandemic has offered that they don't feel safe leaving their homes, so they're not safe in their home. If we're talking about homes, and we all know that domestic violence spans a much larger environmental piece than that. But if they didn't feel safe leaving before and reporting, they certainly don't right now. And the access that those that harm them is so much closer that it really has doubled the barrier, so to speak. I'm not an academic, but I feel very strongly. So thanks to you academics, because you help us figure out policy, program, and how we can move forward to make sure we address this. So I have found the information very, very informative and critical. Again, we've done our own report, which I'll upload into the file. Ours is a little bit different about service provision and certainly a small sample, but also really good information. I will also provide the contact information here so that as we think about how to implement and develop a response to this, I know that we are going to be very energetic about that, about how we can make sure that whatever it is that we're moving forward is responsive in a good way, using the data that you all have provided and certainly the data that we have to develop and implement programs that respond to that. So with that, I'll ask any of my panelists or not my panelists. I don't like when we use that way. I will ask our esteemed panelists, does anyone have any kind of closing remarks now that you've heard the others present, and something that because I do it every time I say, oh God, I forgot to mention that. So if any of you have something, feel free to just kind of jump in, and then I will take a second to check the chat box.
I just wanted to follow up on something Elaine's group presented that's a little different that we're finding. And I think it's fascinating when you're looking at service providers. And so one thing we're hearing is kind of about the vicarious trauma and the disconnection from their fellow staff workers. And so like I normally would see them and talk about cases, and I'm not having that. And they've talked about how they've tried to implement things, but also they're having high staff turnovers. They've lost some grant funding. The CARES money that they gotten has come later. And so it made me start thinking this week about the vicarious trauma of our service providers. I mean, they already experienced probably a lot of vicarious trauma, but then with this, and what I'm hearing on our end, and this might be just a US based issue, is that they're not finding that work-life balance. They feel like they're working more on the computer and on their phones. So several have said, like, I don't turn my phone off now. Like normally I would turn it off when I go home. And now I'm not turning off, I'm leaving it on 24/7 to be available to people. And so I do think that's interesting. I think some of your folks were saying they have found some work-life balance, and I'm hearing kind of the opposite. And I just think that's an interesting structural thing, if it's a difference in how our countries and how our service organizations are structured or work, and it makes me wonder how to move forward, how to help mitigate some of those things and make it go back to normal, where there is some of those boundaries and self-care practices in place for our service providers.
Great. Tara and panelists, we have a great question here from Jay, and he wants to know, how do we reduce the size of this pool of people at risk? So in other words, and let's work beyond providing services after crisis point. So I believe Jay is coming from a prevention perspective, preventing this from happening. Do any of you have a response to that? How do we sort of prevent this before they get to this point.
Do you mind if I just jump in, Ruth, and
Absolutely.
pick up what? Yeah, so I'll pick up a little bit of what Bethany said, and then and link that through, I think, to Jay. And I know that Debbie had clicked on before. I think one of the things is then, and Debbie will probably pick this up, Bethany. I think that living with abuse did a lot of work to try and address that isolation and that vicarious trauma, really recognising that, because they always do provide clinical supervision, and what was told to us is that actually they upped that and they made sure, I can't remember, Debbie will tell you, but I think it's meant to be every 6 weeks, and they made sure that it was every 6 weeks, and they introduced the buddy systems, and they did all sorts of things because they were concerned about that. Staff did also, they talked about some training they had about developing new strategies, because people would say, the thing I always do, one of the interviews I did, the person said, the thing I always do is when I go home, it doesn't matter, they worked in a police station, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, I walk the dog, I do whatever before I go to bed, so everything's out of my head, and I can't do that when I just move next door, you know, from my bedroom to my lounge. So I think they're the sorts of things, so that I think it was very conscious. But Debbie, you may want to pick up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was something that we were immediately very concerned about, is that our staff were having these issues literally brought into their home, and they were not going to have those sort of usual strategies and processes in place. Plus that they themselves were dealing with their own issues. They were having to educate children at home. They were worried about loved ones. We had a number of staff that lost people during the pandemic. So, you know, we were aware that our staff were very vulnerable. So it was immediately something that we prioritised and started, you know, as a management structure, how we, you know, protect them as much as possible. So we did increase the rates of clinical supervision that people were having. We always had team meetings monthly, and initially they went to weekly. And then teams decided that for themselves whether that was too much and whether they wanted them to go fortnightly, and they had a level of control of how often they needed to do that. Obviously managers were available, but a lot of it was us giving them permission to switch off and saying, you know, we want you to still put these things in place, we want you to turn your phone off, you need to work out. We had other staff that were saying it was better for them, could they work a little bit more in the evening because it was easier when their children weren't around to some of the jobs, and some of their service users, that was better for them too. So we kind of you know, gave permission effectively to them to work in a way that suited them, to take time out if they needed to, and just to let us know that, you know, we weren't going to be, as you know, prescriptive. We're not asking for them to do timesheets and stuff like that to, you know, justify that they're doing every hour of their jobs, that people had to do what was right for them and their families as well as for their clients. And, you know, by giving them that sort of permission, effectively, you know, they did the best that they were going to do, and for different staff that meant different things, but we were able to have a sort of open dialogue about how that would affect people. So I feel that our staff have been fairly well throughout, and any time they felt that they weren't doing well, that they you know, they knew that they could speak up and say that without sort of getting any judgment or any criticism, and that we would do what we could to help them facilitate to do their jobs to the best of their abilities. So I think it has been really important, and you know, I certainly hope that most organisations were able to respond in that way. But yeah, it's certainly that vicarious trauma, particularly, you know, say, you know, bringing that into your home, you know, where we talk about, you know, children that have been abused and things like that. Some of the stories really are graphic, and to not have that chance to switch off from that is particularly, you know, difficult. So we did encourage people to do it. I think just on the question around the, you know, the sort of changing the stress and the anger in relationships, I imagine most people would feel the same, is that for us, we're a specialist children's service, and we've mentioned that we've seen an increase in children using violence during this period. I think it, you know, it really does go back to sort of the old stable thing that we need to be starting in schools. We need to have these conversations as early as possible, and give, you know, people the skills to recognise, to you know, reflect on their own behaviour, to understand how they're behaving, and to you know, to be able to have honest dialogue about that, to improve communication in families, and to, you know, the sooner that we start having those conversations at home and in the schools, the better, really, I think, for society.
Great, thank you, Elaine and Debbie. With that, I will turn it over to Tara. You have a question in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that, but are you and Justin able to discuss some of the factors behind those variations in data between cities?
So Pramila, I hope that's how you say your name. So I was going to ask for some clarification. So are you asking about variation in the data or the findings? And I can speak to both of those, because I think you might be asking, are there different definitions in, what might constitute a domestic violence call for service in Orlando versus Baltimore? Or you might be asking if we can speak to the differences in the findings across jurisdictions. So so it looks like you're unmuting yourself, so I'll let you clarify for me.
Hi there, I hope you're able to hear me. Sometimes my mic doesn't work too well.
Yeah.
Hi, but more in terms of the findings, I'm just really particularly, I'm sorry, I don't know much of the geography of the cities. I'm coming from Toronto at the moment. But is it because like it's between rural and like more urban cities? Because I'm just really interested in seeing why there's so much variation in between factors of people seeking help.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an awesome question, and I'm going to answer it the best that you can, or the best I can, but I'll also just say, we really don't know. I mean, like I can't give you, a simple, straightforward answer. And what's really interesting, I think is, so for example, Baltimore City, Maryland is one of the jurisdictions that we looked at, and there was an increase in both police calls for service and victim service agency calls for service, but the victim service agency saw a much greater increase. Well, really right down the road in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was like this week, a paper that was published by a group of colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania that showed that both police and victim service agencies experienced a decrease in calls for service within Philadelphia right after stay-at-home orders were in place. Now, they only looked at, Justin, shake your head if I'm right, about 5 months of data. So it was like March through the fall. So they weren't able to do as sophisticated of an analysis that we were and really estimate a counterfactual using those multiple years of previous data. But it was interesting to see that a city with very similar demographics, very similar in terms of urbanization, sort of being a minority majority city with a lot of sort of social and political and economic disenfranchisement, that Philadelphia saw the exact opposite impact that we saw in Baltimore. So I think it really just highlights, the inability to universally generalize, our sort of national statistics, or even these meta-analyses that we're seeing now that combine lots and lots of cities together and, produce a, overall impact or overall increase or decrease, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going on in your city. And it's super frustrating for us because we can't provide those beautiful, easy policy implications other than to say, we might really need to be focusing, laser focused at a local level, because we are seeing very different results across what we would expect to be similar cities. I mean, the same thing in Hartford, Connecticut is pretty similar to Baltimore and Philadelphia. And we did see similar trends in regard to increases in both police and victim service agency calls between Hartford and Baltimore, but the sort of severity was they didn't track, right? So Hartford police, I think they saw like a little bump, but nowhere near the bump that Baltimore Police Department did. So, and I think a lot of that is local, could be some local, issues with police, community relations, and things going on in that city. the previous paper that Justin and I worked on, we looked at Seattle, but we only looked at police calls for service. And what we found just for Seattle, not for the other 5 jurisdictions, was that police calls for service for other things took a huge nosedive right around the time where they were seeing a lot of social and political activism around, the Black Lives Matter movement, but police calls for service for domestic violence increased. So you can see there really an example of how there could be local effects even on, the types of calls going on in that jurisdiction. So it's really hard to sort of pick that up and apply it to another city. I hope that answered your question or left you with more questions than you started with probably.
Thank you. Thank you. It did answer and left me nicely with more questions that I can look at now.
And I'd like to just, particularly for our panelists, to think about one of the other problems with even addressing this particular topic and issue is the varying definitions of domestic violence, right? So let's go way back to the root cause, and then how systems are reporting it because of local jurisdiction, right? Or local community and how they do that. Even outside of this issue, we have always found it challenging to try to gather information about domestic violence and of trying to, because first you have to understand the community and the jurisdiction that you're getting it from and how they're addressing it, even their language, right? And their policies and their definitions can sometimes be really challenging. So to some degree that speaks to why we see those variances. You've identified other reasons why, but that one is kind of like the root cause of it all, right? Any other thoughts, comments, concerns, ideas? No? Okay, so I'd like to give a round of applause to our panelists who have done a fantastic job, not only in the work, but presenting this information to you today. I hope that you will take this information as we begin to think about, oh, look at all the claps. I love that. That we begin to take this information and think about how we're going to approach it, because it will be a critical issue that we'll need to deal with in the coming months, coming years, right? What is that impact that survivors have had to deal with and service providers have had to deal with, and how do we move forward in the quote unquote new normal and service provision in particular. I think it will be interesting and fascinating, but I firmly believe that all of us on this call have a commitment to making sure that we do all that we can to address the program's policy, funding, resources, tools, whatever it is that we need to come together to make sure that we provide and get it done. So thank you all so much for attending. To my panelists, it's been a pleasure to get to know you. I hope that we will join together again. Feel free, you're welcome, Bethany. Feel free to reach out to any one of us on the panel. They have provided their information on their slides. I provided mine in the chat box, and we look forward to hearing from you as we move forward on addressing this particular issue. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ruth, and bye.